second thing that makes the Nordic Bronze Age the best is thriving trade. So this point is actually the easiest one to speak about from the archaeological finds. This is, of course, the number one piece of evidence that archaeologists have noticed when examining the Nordic Bronze Age. They had not just imported goods to Scandinavia, but they had Scandinavian exported goods found in the south of Europe and other places. The main export from Scandinavia that we know of, at least, was amber. There has been Baltic amber found as far as ancient Egyptian tombs even. But it's also been found all along the Amber Road as well, like you see in this map. The Amber Road is what they called it, and that was the main trade route. Other than, of course, they could have traded by sea. So the north exported amber. That was the number one thing, or at least what we know of. It was the number one export, but I'm sure there was much more. I mean, this is, 3,000-4,000 years ago sometimes, and a lot of these traded goods might not have survived the ages for the archaeologists to find. So what we can say for sure is that amber was the number one export from the north of Europe. The number one import, what Scandinavia brought in from the south, was the metals. Gold and, of course, bronze was the top ones. Some of the things we find date as early to the 15th and 14th centuries BC. They had things brought in from Mycenaean Greece, things like hilted swords and other weapons, but also household items like camp stools, drinking vessels, tools for bodily care like razors and tweezers. And a lot of these things, the style was almost identical to the Mycenaean Greek things, with these kind of spiral decorations, solar symbols, chariots, and so on, things like that. Stuff that we don't really find in other areas of Europe at the time. So it shows the archaeologists think that the Scandinavians imported more of this than anyone else. And it's even sometimes difficult to say how much of it was imported versus what they were making themselves in the north of Europe before they started trading with the south. Southern Scandinavia especially produced and deposited in burials more elaborate bronzes and graves than any other region of Europe. More swords made out of bronze have also been found in Bronze Age Denmark more than anywhere else in Europe. Also evidence for horse-drawn chariots, probably from before even they were used in ancient Greece, we think. Some examples of these rich burials were Håga, the mound, and Kivik grave in Sweden, and also the Lyssehøj grave in Denmark. And guys, many of these finds are more decorated and rich and advanced than the finds from the Viking Age, which was 2,000 years later sometimes. So this has led archaeologists to believe that the Norse was the most advanced with metal production and maybe even technology in general than other areas of Europe. And it remained like this for, like I said, the whole 1,500 years until the Bronze Age ended pretty much. So the main thing, again, that I want you to take from this section is compare it to ancient Greece. Same kind of technology, same kind of development and weapons and things like that. And all these, genius philosophers and technology and democracy and peace and also strength and health that we find in ancient Greek society. The same kinds of things were probably happening in Scandinavia. We just don't have any written records of it like we do from Greece, but all the other signs point to Scandinavia being on the same playing field, just like ancient Greece in all of those things. Next, let's talk about the settlements and living arrangements. Some people falsely assume that Bronze Age towns or villages were little more than a campsite, closer to the hunter-gatherers living in tents than a proper city. Most people expect Bronze Age Scandinavians to be living in shacks, sleeping together with their livestock, but this is of course not the case. There were definitely some people living like that in certain times and places in the Nordic Bronze Age, but when we uncover a lot of these archaeological finds of larger settlements, we find tons of big longhouse type buildings, just as big, if not bigger, than the longhouses we find in the Viking Age. Some of them were very big, up to 500 square meters. Just to give an idea, that is a little bit bigger than a basketball court. And many of these were fortified with walls, and the longhouses usually had some surrounding smaller buildings, but not too many. This is a really important thing. So the longhouse seems like a common meeting place from a people covering a vast area, but not necessarily a tightly packed city or settlement. A lot of people get the wrong idea from the Viking TV shows and movies of these dark little crappy halls where the king lives and it's all crowded and there's a village surrounding it full of shacks of people living in poverty right next to each other. But the opposite was actually true. Here we are, sometimes 2,000 years before the Viking Age, some of these longhouses were found, and you can see how big some of these halls were. There were room for many dozens of people to both live and feast in, but remember, the surrounding buildings to these longhouses were not that many. So this shows us that most likely the longhouse was the center meeting point for the whole village that spanned out a wide area. Maybe the chieftain lived in the longhouse, but everyone else did not live all tight on top of each other like that near the city center, near the longhouse. Most people lived in the surrounding areas, maybe many kilometers away, which means everybody owned plenty of land. They weren't living on top of each other. They were independent and free, but still connected by a certain region and longhouse and chieftain. And at certain times, they would meet at this central longhouse to do things like celebrating holidays, or trade with each other, or talk business, or get together to fight off invaders, or whatever. And this setup, this settlement style, lasted for 2,000 years before the Viking Age, and finally large towns started to pop up in the mid to late Viking Age. Is it because these barbarians are just primitive and stupid and they weren't advanced enough to build cities? No, absolutely not. It's because we didn't want to build cities, okay? We didn't want to live on top of each other like peasants, because cities are shitholes, and we never wanted to live like that anyway. And we still don't. Scandinavia is still relatively low density populated, and for good reason. Cities are filled with disease and poverty and conflict. This has always been the case throughout history, so don't look down on a culture or a people because they didn't build cities, because maybe they had traveled down to Greece or Rome and think, oh, well, who the hell would want to live like this? I don't want that coming into my homeland. Like I've been saying, the Nordic Bronze Age always has the perfect balance. Just enough civilization so that your tribe is well structured and connected through trade and relationships and working together, and they were good enough protected, so they were not easy targets for invaders, like the hunter-gatherers would be, but at the same time, the Nordic Bronze Age was not too civilized that they developed into big cities living on top of each other, at each other's throats like they were in other places at the time. Next point, I may also quickly touch upon the